particular sermon is Jesus intensifying the law? Is he adding to it? Is he making it harder? For example, so you do not murder, but if you've been angry in your heart at your brother, you've already murdered him, right? Is that making the law harder? Is it intensifying the law? Or is Jesus explicating the law, in which case he's getting down into the minute details of the law and explaining the heart behind it? So explication is what he's doing. He's explicating the law. He is not intensifying the law. Okay? His main audience is not Gentiles, surprisingly. It's the crowd who in Galilee would be Jews. He's also got his disciples there who are Jewish, right? And he's got the Pharisees and the scribes who are also. So it makes sense that he's talking about the Torah, right? He's talking about the law. And going against maybe some of what the Pharisees and the scribes are teaching, trying to get at the heart of it. What were the Pharisees, Sadducees, even the Essenes known for?
Following the law in its minutia.
Well, not even really following the law in its minutia. They created this fence around the law. Okay? For example, the number of steps you could take on the Sabbath without it being considered work. Okay?
It's funny that they created all of these little things, but kind of forgot the gist of
right.
Love thy neighbor.
Which is do not work on the Sabbath, right? This is no work on Sabbath. Or the Sabbath is a rest day. So they took it and they said, well, because Sabbath is a rest day, resting means we can't work. Okay? But then even Jesus says what? Which one of you who on the Sabbath has an ox go into the ditch will not go get his neighbor to pull it out? Right? Has nothing to do with work and everything to do with setting aside the day as a day for God. But they went with number of steps on the Sabbath. In modern Judaism, they cannot engage electrical connections on the Sabbath. Okay? So I've shared the story when I was in Israel. There's the Shabbat elevator, right? It stops on every floor on the way up and every floor on the way down. And that's the elevator you get on the Sabbath if you don't want to violate that law. You can't start your car. You can't do a whole bunch of stuff. You can't... refrigerators now have what's called a Sabbath setting.
Really?
Where when you open the door, it turns off, the light doesn't come on. Because if you turn on a light, you've engaged an electrical circuit. And so anyway, yeah.
When I was young,
It's craziness.
I lived in the heart of the Jewish community.
Uh-huh.
In fact, when I was in a school, in the 6th grade, I was the only non-Jew in a large class. And the rabbi lived 4 houses down the street from us. And so a couple of times I was invited to come down to his house, once to turn on the garbage disposal, and once having to do with the lights.
So in these Jewish hotels that are Jewish run and owned, who do they get to work on Friday night into Saturday night? Gentiles. Right. Okay. They are not allowed to cook on Sabbath. So everything has to be prepared before, okay? Which means when they want to make coffee, they have to boil the water, which I don't know how they get away. Like, it's a special thing that they get on the Sabbath to boil the water. Anyway, they got to boil the water. They pour it into an empty cup, all right? And then they let the water cool off such that it won't cook the grounds when they pour it into the instant coffee. But this is that fence post that they put around the law. Another one that they put around, so there's a number of steps on the Sabbath. There's ritual hand washing, which Jesus kind of gets after, right? After you would deal with Gentiles, you would have to like ritually wash your hands. It wasn't even really hand washing. It was more like very ritualistic. Oath taking is another one. Like what oaths are binding. We looked at that last week. If you swear by X, it's not binding, but if you swear by Y, it is binding, even though they sound like you're saying the same thing. We talked about that, oath taking. But that was so you don't take God's name in vain, okay? So they have all these different fence posts that they've put around to keep them from violating the law. And Jesus is saying, you know what, those don't matter. Those fence posts don't matter. Jesus himself was probably a Pharisee. We've talked about that. So he's calling out the religious movement from inside, because in order to be a teaching rabbi, he had to belong to one of the sects in order to basically get credibility. He wouldn't have belonged to the Sadducees. Why? They were sad because they didn't have a resurrection, so they were sad, you see, right? They didn't belong to the Essenes because they were a little bit extremist, some of the things that they believed. He wouldn't have belonged to the Zealots because, again, zeal is something you do with a knife. And so Simon the Zealot belonged to the Zealots, right? That's why they called him that. So Jesus wouldn't have belonged to the Zealots. He wouldn't have really belonged to any of the other orders, really. So Pharisees kind of the logical conclusion, because they believed in the resurrection. They believed in more of a literal interpretation of the scriptures as opposed to more allegorical like you have with the Sadducees. So he's calling out his own order from within. And he's saying it's not about intensification, which is what you're doing. You're adding to the law. It's about the heart of the law. And so we're going to look at what Jesus says about love for your enemies. So let's read that. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 43. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be like your Father in heaven, since he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Even tax collectors do the same, don't they? And if you only greet your brothers, what more do you do? Even the Gentiles do the same, don't they? So then be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. All right. So here's some fun things to dig into this passage. How many of you have love your neighbor in like bold or somehow other kind of set out from the... No, in that verse there in 43, you've heard it said, love your neighbor. Okay, it's not set out in any way. Okay, so love your neighbor, that's from where? It's from the Torah. Okay, love your neighbor. And so in some translations that's offset, like in mine here it's bolded to show that this is what you've heard said, to set it apart. But Jesus is referring to the quote from Leviticus 19:18, which says, you shall love your neighbor. Jesus seems to see this as a crucial text, and it's even listed in the Ten Commandments when he gives that recitation in Matthew 19. In Mark 12:31, it is the second greatest commandment after Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5. Anybody remember what Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5 is? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? So Paul uses this text. If you look at, so we see it in John, we see it in Matthew, we see it in Mark, we see it in Luke, and then we see it, Paul. This is kind of an interesting thing. Paul actually says this also, or something similar to it, in Romans chapter 13. Let's take a look there. Romans chapter 13. If you've hit the Corinthians in, you've gone too far. Romans chapter 13. All right, just a clue as to how your Bible is put together. I don't know if I've ever shared this, but Paul's epistles are not in chronological order. They're in content order. Biggest books first, shortest books last. John will also do the same thing. So the epistles of John, you notice the longer books are first, the shorter books are second and third. Okay? It's just the way they do it. First Peter is longer than Second Peter. Romans is longer than 1 Corinthians. It's longer than 1 Corinthians is longer than Second, and so on and so forth. All right. Sorry. 13, 8 through 10. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet. And if there is any other commandment that's summed up in this, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does not wrong a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Because if you violate the law, you have wronged your neighbor. Right? So, this seems to be a pretty big deal for Jesus, as is love your neighbor. Hate your enemy, however, is not a quote from the Old Testament, but is commonly drawn from inference by Jewish exclusivistic religionists. Okay, now that's a big way of saying these sects. Okay, so sectarianism is really what it's talking about here. The Pharisees, who were more traditional, hated the Sadducees, who were more theologically liberal, who hated the Essenes, who were very extremists, who hated the Zealots, who were also hated by the Pharisees and also hated by... So, hate your enemy. Hate those who are different from you. This also extends beyond just the sectarianism. All of these guys are united in their hate for what?
Jesus.
No. Well, sort of. But no. There you go. In fact, a common Hebraic euphemism for Gentiles is children of wrath. Okay? They would also call them the uncircumcised, and not in a kind way, right? And so likewise, then the Gentiles started calling them the circumcised as a term of derision, okay? There was this extreme hatred here, and Jesus plays on that. Do you see how he plays on that here in this section? Any idea? There's one word where he's playing at this idea of Gentiles being a hated category by all Jews.
Right here, but dogs, calls them dogs.
Gentile dogs, it was another name, right? But there's one word in here. They came out of this Jewish group. Oh, that's too close. Tax collectors. Okay, so if you're Roman, you have a superior culture, you have a superior language. In Latin, you'll speak Greek when you're going to do trade, because Greek is the lingua franca, like English is today. All right? But they would not stoop to learn the barbarian tongues, generally. Okay? Hebrew and Aramaic would have fallen under that category. Okay? So we're not going to bother to learn Aramaic, and really, if we're doing business, we want there to be no confusion. And there were some in these Jewish territories that didn't speak the Greek language at all. In fact, the only reason we have Greek anywhere in the temple, think the Thanatos stone, okay, which is that dividing partition wall that said, on one side it had temple guards, and it said any Gentile crossing this threshold is immediately subject to death. That was in Greek. The only reason it was in Greek was because of the Sadducees. The Sadducees had control of the temple, and so they had Greek in there. If it had been up to the Pharisees, there would have been no Greek. Okay, they despised the language. Okay, they still used it, but they despised it. Okay? So, if you want to collect taxes from a native population and you don't want to learn the barbarian tongue, what is the best way to collect taxes? You use Jews. And so they would go to these Jewish communities and they would pull out tax collectors. Who's the most famous one? Matthew. Who's another famous one? Zacchaeus. There you go. These guys were hated by the Jews. Hated. They were seen as, we would use a term today like race haters. Okay? Like they hated their own race because they did this. All right? Because you're working for the oppressors.
So they spoke Greek then?
Well, the tax collectors would have spoken Greek. They were businessmen. But if they're dealing with their people, they're speaking Hebrew or more likely Aramaic. And they are then going to the Romans and turning it in, speaking Greek, maybe even Latin. Okay? Those were the four big languages in Israel at the time: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. So when you're getting stuff all the way from China on the Silk Road, which we know happened, the Chinese are not going to be speaking Chinese to the Jews or to the Romans or to anybody in that area, really. There's that language barrier, so they're going to be speaking Greek. Anyway, tax collectors were viewed as traitors. Okay? They were famous for inflating the taxes of their Jewish people. What is one of the commandments that you're not supposed to do, one Jew to another? Usury. Yeah. Usury. Which is to charge interest or extort a great payment. So what these Jews would do, and we see this in Zacchaeus' account, is they would say, let's say I owed $60 in taxes. Okay? They would say, all right, really, you owe $100 in taxes. All right? Now what they're going to do is they're going to take this $60, they're going to pay it to Rome, they're going to take the $40 that's left over, and they're going to put it straight in their pockets. Okay? In addition to what Rome was already going to pay them anyway, as a tax collector, as a job. All right? Here's the thing about Rome, though. Rome also knew they were inflating the tax numbers, and they didn't care. As long as we get our cut, and you're not too greedy about it, commission. All right? So when Zacchaeus says, I will give all of my wealth back to the poor, right? And I will pay every man back twice what I have stolen from him. This is what he's talking about. That's some right there. Tax collectors were wealthy. They were hated. They were viewed as no better than Gentile dogs. So when Jesus says here, nope, I'm not in Matthew anymore. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Even the tax collectors do that. These people who are less than, these people who are race traitors, even they love those who love them. So you think you're special just because you love those who love you? You're no better than they are. Digging the knife in there a little bit, right? And if you only greet your brothers, what more do you do? Even Gentiles do the same, don't they? Gentiles, we greet our brothers. We say, hey, what's going on, man? Love you. They're like, what more? Like, you are no better than the people that you hate, i.e., your sectarian enemies, the tax collectors, the Gentiles. Gentile guy, the Samaritan, he's the one who stops and helps the dude. And Jesus even says, who is the neighbor in that story? And everybody's like, oh, well, it was the Samaritan, which would have blown everyone's minds at the time, because the Samaritans are these good-for-nothing half-bloods that have the wrong temple, they have the wrong writings, they have the wrong law, they have the wrong everything. But even they understand what a neighbor is, right? Any questions on that section? Praying for those who persecute you would have been a big deal. We talked about the extra mile yesterday. The extra mile would have been last week. The extra mile would have been a form of persecution, right? Even just the mile, when the Roman soldiers would demand that the Jews would carry their gear for a mile, even that was a form of persecution. To pray for those who persecute you, that seems very radical at the time, because you didn't give the people who persecuted you the time of day, much less pray for them. All right. If there are no questions on that, we'll maybe start this next section. We're doing okay on time.
22, so you're called.
Let's see here. Pure-hearted giving.
So the thought that comes to mind for me is Nero,
Okay.
and how Nero was treating people. And when Paul says, hey, do what, be under Nero's leadership, do what Nero says to do.
Unless what? So that's Romans 13.
Because you want to live in a peaceable society.
Right. Do your best to live at peace with all men. Right, that's what Paul says.
Nero.
Right. But then in Romans 13, he says, obey the government in so much as they are not commanding you to violate the word.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's Romans 13. Let's see. Well, yeah, we probably get through this next section. It's not very long. All right. Chapter 6, pure-hearted giving. Be careful not to display your righteousness merely to be seen by people. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. Thus, whenever you do charitable giving, do not blow a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the streets so that people will praise them. I tell you the truth, they have their reward. But when you do your giving, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your gift may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. All right. So, almsgiving. How many of you have ever heard of that? Almsgiving. So this is specifically about almsgiving. Okay. And for the first century Jew, there were like three practices which were thought to make one right with Yahweh. There was almsgiving, there was prayer, okay, and there was fasting. And Jesus is going to get after all three of these, right? We're going to see that here within the next couple of sections. Almsgiving is basically your offering, your tithe, okay? Now, tithing is not necessarily for the church today, but we still have this idea of giving offerings. But almsgiving is what they would do. And so these Pharisees, these Sadducees, these really rich guys, what they would do is they would fill their coin pouches full. And they would bellow and, like toot their own horn, so to speak. And they would walk up to the box where they would give the offerings in the temple, and they would drop it in there and make this massive noise to let you and everyone else know how much money they had been giving. Because the amount of money that you give directly affects how big your reward is. Okay? In heaven. But Jesus tells a parable about that, doesn't he? He says, the widow who gives a mite, the smallest form of currency, gives more even than the guy who does that. and has a greater reward because of it, because he's giving out of his excess and not even that much. And the way he's doing it isn't good compared to her, who is giving out of her utter need. Right? So almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. And Jesus is going to get after each one of these. So we'll see. This is going to be in 6, 2 through 4. This is going to be in 6, 5 through 15. And the next one is 6, 16 through 18.